Hey everybody, Levi here with Roundtable of Wraith. Just wanted to put together a video on Azalea and kind of my current deck that I'm looking to play right now, as well as kind of discuss a bunch of the different cards that we got. In Everfest we had a lot of really interesting cards, and I think some are supported really well and fit really well into what Azalea is trying to do right now, and some of them don't quite fit right now. But overall, we got some really nice upgrades, and I think that Azalea is probably in the best spot she's ever been. So yeah, I'm just gonna kind of dive in and go over some different stuff. So the first one that I want to jump into is kind of the most heated discussion in any Azalea chat right now is gonna be discussing the two bows. We've got the brand new Dreadbore and the, what's the phrase, tried and true Death Dealer. Yeah, on paper, I think Dreadbore seems really interesting. The ability to turn off some defense reactions seems really strong. However, I'm just not quite convinced. Keep in mind, I am going to be doing this through the perspective of using Skillbone Crossstrap as our main headpiece. I think it's one of the strongest pieces of equipment that Azalea has access to. I would argue second to Death Dealer, but that's aside. If you were to look at a New Horizon list with Dreadbore, I think there might be something there, but overall I'm not quite convinced. But for all of this, I'm going to just be under the assumption that we're playing Skillbone Crossstrap, because it fits so well with what Azalea's hero ability does and kind of how all the play patterns work. So the issues that we're going to run into playing Dreadbore are that one, I guess the first and primary issue is we're not drawing the card. Azalea is, I guess in all fairness, most of her cards are understated. They don't pack quite as much of a punch as any other deck, the cards in other decks, so that's kind of offset by having the extra value from the Death Dealer. So a lot of these play patterns are going to also, with Death Dealer, going to allow us to block additional cards, or block with additional cards and still get the draw. And that lets us set up arsenals, which let us use the cross wrap. And yeah, and I don't think that the +1 attack makes up for the card draw. I think the easiest way for me to look at it is if there was a card that I could play in my deck that said, your next arrow attack has +1 attack, and your opponent cannot play defense reactions from their hand. Would I play that in this deck? And I think the answer is no. I think that's an awful card, and I don't think you would play it in any deck. Because trading a card for +1 damage and blocking defense reactions from hand just isn't a good trade. Assuming you have good cards in your deck, or at least the best you have access to, drawing a card, any card in your deck is going to, on average, do more than the effect of the Dreadbore. So as long as you've built your deck to accommodate that extra card drawn, I think Death Dealer just wins out in almost every situation. There are a few notable interactions with the Dreadbore that actually make me interested in if there is a viable Dreadbore list. The first would be Seek and Destroy. Well, I guess let me actually just dive back into that. It says defense reactions can't be played from their hand. Now, the problem with that is when you attack with Dreadbore, or with an arrow while you have Dreadbore, your opponent isn't going to play their Sink Below from their hand. They're not going to play their Fate Foreseen from their hand. They'll just block with other cards. And then on the next turn, they're just going to put it in the arsenal. So as far as the defense reactions from hand, all we're really doing with Dreadbore is delaying the defense reaction. We're not stopping it. We're just delaying it. It's coming next turn. But there are we've got a handful of cards that let us actually deal with the problem. The first, I already mentioned, was Seek and Destroy, but this is the first one I came across. We've got the new Battering Bolt. This card has actually surprised me. It has felt really good. It's obviously not coming in every matchup, but just even in some matchups, just being a 3-block, having 6 power, it packs a little more of a punch. So in some matchups where Sleep Dart or Fatigue Shot aren't doing anything, Battering Bolt can just be a solid arrow. But the idea here is that by blocking it out of their hand, they can't use the defense reaction, and now if Battering Bolt hits, they're going to lose the defense reaction, and they can't Arsenal it the next turn. And obviously, I mentioned it before, but I'll grab the card if I could find it. The next notable interaction is going to be the Seek and Destroy. And that's going to be the same thing. If you hit, they're going to end up losing that defense reaction, because obviously they won't be able to play it on their turn, and if they try and Arsenal it, it'll be destroyed. So these are two cards that synergize really well with Dreadbore. Probably the final one that I know gets brought up is going to be Bolt and Shot. Bolt and Shot, just inherently having Go Again from Dreadbore, is going to make it just, it's just good. Like, 1 cost, 5 Go Again is good. The problem is that's only really 3 cards. And these are Majestic, so you can't even run more than 3. Bolt and Shot, you would be running the other colors, which are just kind of underwhelming below red. I guess you could argue yellow's fine, but below red it starts getting worse and worse. So those are kind of the synergies that Dreadbore has. The problem is, well, I argued that the draw is going to be better than the effect on Dreadbore. That was always assuming that we're getting the +1 on Dreadbore. The problem is that Dreadbore only affects arrows that you load and doesn't affect the other arrows. So that means by default we're going to have anti-synergy with a bunch of cards in our deck. Notably, anti-synergy with Azalea's Hero Power. It's not a good look when you have a weapon that inherently has anti-synergy with your own hero. But that's aside the point. The others are just going to be anything we've got that was looking to set up Dominate. Stuff like Memorial Ground. We're just, any play pattern that's going to load Dreadbore to put something in the Dreadbore to load, put it in Arsenal, and then use Azalea's ability to put it into the Arsenal. Whether that's with Memorial Ground, or doing it blind, or with Knock the Death Whistle. We've just straight lost a card. Well, not quite straight lost a card. We've also stopped defense reactions from hand. So then that goes back to that comparison I made at the start, which was, would you play a card that said +1 and they can't play defense reactions from hand? Now, in the situation where we're dominating it, it's gotten even worse. It's straight just, would you play a card that says, your next attack, your opponent can't play defense reactions from their hand? And I don't think you would in any deck. That's an awful card. Unless you know that they have a bunch in their hand, it's just not good. Another issue that we have with Dreadbore is that there aren't really many arrows that it's pushing a relevant breakpoint on, right? Whoops. So most decks are going to run a lot of 3 blocks. A lot of decks are just all 3 blocks. And so something like Dreadbore to load a Red in the Ledger, this Red in the Ledger is going to come in for 6 instead of 5. And if they can't use defense reactions from hand, that's going to come in for 6 instead of 5. If they can't use defense reactions from hand, they're going to block with 2 cards. And realistically, this coming in for 5 was already going to be a 2-card block. So that 1 extra damage doesn't really do anything there, unless they had a 2 block, or were planning on using equipment plus a defense reaction, or something along those lines. But in a lot of situations, these 5 attack arrows are getting blocked by 2 cards from hand anyways. So Dreadbore extra damage there is often going to be irrelevant on your arrows that have relevant hit effects. So that's kind of where I stand on Death Dealer versus Dreadbore. Art is super cool. It's a super interesting concept. The fact that it works with New Horizon is interesting, but right now I don't think that there's enough cards that specifically synergize with Dreadbore in order to make Dreadbore a viable choice. I know a lot of people are also talking about putting it in the sideboard, but if I was playing Guardian, which I've played a decent amount of Guardian, and I sat down against an Azalea and they brought out Dreadbore, I would be ecstatic. Because that means they're playing down a card every turn, and I've just got a bunch of 3 blocks, and I can still play my defense reactions from Arsenal. Oldham can still use his defense reaction. It's really just defense reactions get stuck in your hand. But that's fine, because I'll just put them in Arsenal. I guess the exception would be maybe Oldham, but the problem is you're losing so much tempo by being down cards that you just, okay, you're leaking a little more damage, but you end up taking more damage as well. So overall, I don't think Dreadbore quite isn't quite there right now. I don't think it's supported enough. So everything from here on is going to be talking about Crosswrap and Death Dealer. So let me get that out of the way. Cool. So the building an Azalea deck is interesting because it's inherently different to almost every other deck in the way you want to build it. And typically in other decks, you're looking to have a portion of the deck that's there for pitching that is never going to get played, and then you've got like your blues, and then you've got a portion of the deck that's going to be the cards you want to play, your reds. Now, the issue that Azalea runs into is by not having a weapon that does damage, you are going to have issues with fatigue, right? You're going to be cycling through your deck quickly. Obviously, Death Dealer is going to do that as well, make you draw through your deck quickly. So Azalea, in pretty much any matchup, is the most likely to get to the end of the deck and or run out of cards. Now, what that means is when you start running low on cards, you need to be able to kill your opponent with those remaining cards. And unlike something like Katsu, where he's still got his Kadachis, even if he's low on cards and he's just coming around to blues, he can still Kadachi effectively. Azalea, on the other hand, is going to slowly get worse and worse, because that card quality, if you're running blues, you're going to be drawing a bunch of blues and attacking with them. And attacking with an arrow for 3 with a +1 buff or a +2 buff is just not going to ever close out a game, especially when you're getting to that stage of the game far before your opponent. Your opponent's still going to be maybe just entering their second cycle, but realistically, a lot of times they're going to still be on their first cycle. So the way that we counteract that in Azalea is not running many blues. My current list has 6 blues in it. And those are going to be 3 Knock the Death Whistle, which in reality is honestly, I know it's going to sound awful and all the Ranger players are going to hate me, but this card isn't that great. Card's good. It makes the cut as a blue 3 block, and it lets you close out games when you get around to second cycle, but realistically, in a world where we had slightly better cards, I could see this getting cut out of the deck at some point in the future. Spending an entire card to give an arrow dominate is often underwhelming. The fact that it's also tutoring the arrow that you're looking for makes it slightly better. But if this was like a red 2 block, I would never play this card. The fact that it's a blue 3 block lets me pitch and block with it effectively in hands that don't use it properly. But those are the 3 blues there, and then I've also got 3 blue Ridge Rider shots. Ridge Rider shot is another arrow that I guess we'll dig into a little bit of how second cycle works, purely because I'm talking about the blues. So when we start getting to second cycle, we should, against fatigue decks, hopefully have a health lead. And at that point, that's where we need to start going, okay, I realize my opponent sees that I don't have many cards left in my deck, I don't know, maybe 15, 20, and they're going, I need to just block out and fatigue them. And that's the stage of the game where being able to load a Ridge Rider shot, it's an opt that's going to let me find an arrow to look for a dominate. Because at that stage of the game, we have to be dominating to be able to close out a game. You're pretty much never going to kill a Guardian on a non-dominated arrow. It just doesn't happen. You don't go wide enough to demand their whole hand. It's the only way to finish off that remaining bit of health is going to be with dominate. So Ridge Rider shot is a card it's going to be a blue 3 block blue 3 block that when you get back to it in the second or third cycle, you load, you draw, and then you get to opt and find another arrow and hopefully find dominate. So that's going to be one kind of recurring theme that we're going to see here. It's one recurring theme that we're going to see is a lot of these cards that we want to pitch and see on second and third cycle are there to set up dominate. They're less so there for tempo and more so there for pushing those remaining few points of health that your opponent should have at that stage of the game. So those are the only blues that I've run in this deck. I know I've said it to other people, and I guess I'll repeat it here, is if Oldhim and Lexi didn't exist, I would play these as yellows. The way that the deck is built is to not need blues. There's very few turns where you need a blue. And the turns where, or rather, there's very few turns where you need 3 resources. And those turns should be supported by Tunic most of the time. Obviously, it's nice when you have the blue, but Tunic should be able to be available for that. So set that aside and dive slightly into... I'll dig into what I was just saying there, is that you don't need blues very often. And the reason you don't need blues very often is because we're going to primarily be playing 1-cost arrows. You know, your red in the ledgers. You're going to have Fatigue Shot is one of the new cards we got in Everfest. It's very strong. Those go off to the side. You know, you've got your red in the ledgers, your Remorseless, your Sleep Dart. You've got... yeah, and Fatigue Shots. Those are the primary arrows that we're going to be playing. And so all of these turn cycles are just going to look like pitching a yellow, you know, pitch a Sleep Dart, load a arrow, red or yellow, depending, draw a card, and then you've got 1 resource floating, and we're going to fire our 1-cost arrow. And that's all of our resources, and we don't need more than that. And the beauty of that lies in the fact that any card we want to add to that turn cycle, we just want to cost 0, which is not too hard to do. Now, it used to be a little more difficult because we didn't have access to good 0-cost buffs. But now we've gotten quite a few more, and that makes filling out those slots much easier. But you've got things like Knock the Death Whistle. That's going to cost 0 to add in there. I guess we'll flash that by there. We've got the Rain Razors are going to cost 0. You've got your Memorial Grounds are going to cost 0. And for a while, yeah, like I said, for a while there we were running Come to Fights, we were running Overflexes, and those were 1-cost buffs. And that's just because we didn't have enough good 0-cost buffs. But now that we do, now that we do, all of our turn cycles should be 0 resources spent on setting up and playing buffs. The only resources we're really spending are going to be loading and firing. So, as far as the buffs I've gotten here, those are pretty standard. We've got the Seek and Destroys, the Take Aims, Read the Glide Path. And you'll notice I've got Read the Glide Path yellows in here, which I'll mention here in a second. These are going to be in the side. Smashing Good Times. And I think that's it for buffs. Yeah, that's going to be it for buffs. So... Smashing, oh, it's 2 smashings, that's something else. Let me put that back. Alright, so for buffs, kind of the baseline you like is going to be that 0 for 3. But we've got a couple here in the Rain Razors and the Read the Glide Path. Since they're yellows, these are often going to get pitched early to pay for your turns. Because any hand where you've got like a yellow Read the Glide Path and, I don't know, say like a yellow Sleep Dart, not one of those. I guess we'll say a blue Ridge Rider. This is a relatively underwhelming hand. You've got something like this and you need to block, right? You want to save a red arrow and you want to save a yellow. So more than likely the Ridge Rider shot and the Sleep Dart would get blocked with. And so you'd be stuck with this. Or left with this. We'll go with left. It sounds a little nicer. We're going to be pitching the yellow Read the Glide Path pretty often early on to just fire this Fatigue Shot. Maybe we draw into a buff and it's a little bit more. But realistically, this Read the Glide Path is going back in the deck and it's going to come around for later cycles. And it's going to have a similar effect to what we were talking about with the blue Ridge Rider shots, in that when we draw this on the second cycle, there's going to be a bunch more yellows that we can use to pitch. Maybe yellow Sleep Dart we're going to pitch this time. But we're able to pitch that other yellow, and we get to play this Read the Glide Path. And it's another option to see the top of our deck and find that Azalea effect. And one really important part about something like Read the Glide Path or Ridge Rider shot, less so Ridge Rider, more so Read the Glide Path, is the fact that unlike Knock the Death Whistle and Memorial Ground, we're not using an entire card to set up that Dominate. I guess we are, but we're also getting +2. And that +2 on a Dominate is, you find a Fatigue Shot on top. You load that in the arsenal and you fire that. That's 7 dominate. Slightly less likely. You'd be a little more likely to find a yellow at that stage of the game, but still, 6 dominate against a lot of decks is going to push a couple damage. And that's what you need to close the game out. If we play these as blues, 1, we have extra resources every time we pitch them, but this is coming in for 4? 4 doesn't close out games like 6 does. So yeah, that's kind of the theory behind running a lot of yellows, in addition to why yellow Read the Glide Path is really, really good in the deck. On those later cycles, it lets you find those last couple points to close out games. There's obviously games where you aren't expecting to get to second cycles, and I don't know. There's a discussion on whether or not Read the Glide Path even stays in those. I think it does, because opting is always strong. But there probably is a discussion to taking out Read the Glide Path in faster matchups, where you need to be more defensive. Like your, I guess Chain would be an example, where this doesn't really serve as good of a purpose, because you're not getting to your second cycle. All right, I'm getting distracted. Read the Glide Path is probably my favorite new card from the set. Yeah, I think it is. It just has added so much to the deck, and being able to just find dominates off the top, or even just dig. I've had a couple of awkward turns where you've got, like a Read the Glide Path, and I don't know, maybe some random, Rain Razors in the arsenal. And just being able to opt with the cross wrap to look at one card, and then Read the Glide Path, look at another card, you get to see 3 cards to try and find an arrow. Or even you add in a Ravenous Rabble, and you can dig one more, and get to see that. I guess Ravenous you'd still only see 3. But just being able to see more cards and set up that Azalea ability to find the card that you need on top of the deck it's just so much value with this card. You can't run blues though. 1 is just not enough, and 1 doesn't add breakpoints to a lot of your 5 damage arrows. I'm gonna lose my voice doing this. I don't talk this much normally. So, what's next? Fatigue shot and sleep dart. All right. So next thing on the discussion is yeah, I'm gonna talk about my second favorite card from the new set, Rain Razors. This card is everything that Azalea wanted. It seems rather innocuous at first. You see just a +2, basically attack reaction. And that, I don't know, doesn't feel like that much. It's just not that much. But this card has a lot of flexibility. Obviously, being able to react with 0 resource just already puts it above Razor Reflex, which was a card that we typically ran at red, but it actually, for a while, was being run at yellow. This is back in the Monarch meta. It was run at yellow for the same reason, is you need these yellows that help you push damage at the end of the game. The thing about Rain Razors versus Razor Reflex, obviously, is it costs 0 instead of 1. But one of the other really big ones is the fact that this card can be in my arsenal, whether that's at the end of the turn. Let's just say I came in with a Sleep Dart on the previous turn, and I'm sitting with a Rain Razors in my hand, and my opponent just, I guess, Sleep Dart probably isn't going to get double blocked as often as something like a Fatigue Shot, but a yellow Fatigue Shot for 4, and they throw 2-3 blocks in front of it. There's no point in throwing the Rain Razors. I can put this in my arsenal. And in the past, Razor Reflex would occasionally end up in the arsenal at the end of your turn just because maybe you didn't have enough resources, or they overblocked or something. Typically, they don't overblock by 3, but either way, it might end up in your arsenal. The beauty of Rain Razors is the fact that I can flip it with cross-wrapped opt, but I can immediately play it. When we were playing Razor Reflex, this card stuck in the arsenal, so I'd opt and hope to find something good, but if I didn't, I just had to send that card to the bottom in Azalea and hope. This is a card that I can play out of my arsenal at the start. I can play it from my hand whenever I want. I can use it as a reaction. It it just fits really well. It also is a yellow, so we can pitch it for late game, which I'll get into some of the value of Rain Razors as well in pitching and setting up second cycle. But overall, this is just better than Razor Reflex, I think, in almost every way. The one exception is the fact that it's a 0, or that it doesn't block. I've been running into occasional issues with Rain Razors in addition to Memorial Ground. Just having multiple no blocks in my hand has felt bad. And honestly, I would cut Memorials before I cut Rain Razors. I've actually been siding out more Memorial Grounds more often in matchups where I know I'm going to need to block more. So that's roughly the buffs. I guess I'll mention Release the Tensions are typically in the sideboard as well. Just throwing all of these buffs in at the same time is too many buffs, especially against aggressive decks where you know you need to block and you aren't going to be able to hold big hands. So yeah, Release the Tension goes in the sideboard. But typically, these are the buffs we're playing in the deck. It's the 15. I guess I'll mention some more stuff with Rain Razors. So here in the equipment, I only am bringing Bullseye Bracers. Now, yeah, I mean, I think Bullseye Bracers are just very strong right now because of Rain Razors. There was a time where there was a discussion between Bracers and Bracers of Belief, and I think Bracers of Belief were actually better. I always stuck with the Bullseyes, but looking back in retrospect, I think, man, the glare in my room is a little bit, so I apologize. I think Bracers of Belief probably were the better option at the time, but I think Bullseye Bracers have become stronger, and I will get into that a little bit more. I do have the 2 different sets of boots now. For a while, Perch Grapplers were the only one we ran, just because Snapdragons you couldn't use quite as effectively, and there wasn't enough of a payoff on them a lot of times. But that's where this card changes things. Rain Razors is going to open up a lot of play lines, notably with Bolt and Shot. So, like, kind of your very basic play line would be, let's say you've got this and one of these arrows in your hand, or actually, yeah, this with one of these arrows in your hand, and no, actually, I guess it would have to be this. We'll just go this, Bolt and Shot plus Rain Razors, and sometimes you have to do this with a Tunic or whatever, but no, we'll just go with the Sleep Dart. So we're pitching Sleep Dart to load a Bolt and Shot, and we come in with Bolt and Shot for 4. Being able to Rain Razor this, bring it to 6, giving it go again, and on hit reload. Typically, if you're coming in for 4, they might know that Rain Razors is coming, but maybe they don't. Maybe they only throw 3, because you can also bluff this. An opponent who's familiar with playing against Azalea knows that this can be punishing, so they might block 4 or have the defense reaction ready for it. But this buffs it to 6, gives it go again, lets you reload, lets you put this Sleep Dart in the arsenal, and we had already pitched a yellow at the start, so then we get to come in for 7. This becomes 13 damage off of 3 cards, which is reasonably good, but the fact is that the Sleep Dart threatens additional damage. Another note here is... Computer went to sleep again. That this just becomes threatening to anyone. You can start with the Rain Razors in Arsenal and you play it. All of a sudden you load a Bolt and Shot and you're coming in for 6 go again. And they're going, I think I need to block this because he gets the reload and he's got 1 floating. If that's an arrow remaining in his hand, he gets to just fire it. I'm going to have a bad time. So this often will get blocks. But the thing is, if they do block this, now we've got the Bullseye Bracers, we load this, and now the Sleep Dart's coming in for 8. Or even worse for them if this is a Remorseless or something. And it gets even scarier for them if we've got a second card in hand. You know, you've got another buff, maybe a Seek and Destroy. All of a sudden, this second arrow is coming in for 6, 7, 8, 11. You know, that Seek and Destroy is going off, and they're losing their arsenal. Or they're just taking 11 so they can play with the remaining hand. The other option is they don't block it, and now you just get the free reload, and you don't have to use the bracers, and that becomes a threat later on. Another option is Bolt and Shot does hit, and this wasn't an arrow. Got him. They called your bluff. They said he doesn't have an arrow, so now you get to reload the random card in your hand. It's called a Read the Glide Path. That card gets put into the arsenal face down. You get to Skullbone Crosswrapped opt, and then use Azalea, and then boom, you could be coming in for a Dominated Arrow. Now you've got the top 2 cards in your deck to try and find that. There's a lot of flexibility here. So Bolt and Shot plus Rain Razors opens up some really explosive lines. Another one also, I guess, we'll mention is, where is it? Take Aim. So you come in with this Bolt and Shot plus Rain Razors for 6, and they go, okay, I'm going to block it out so he doesn't get the reload. Maybe you've already used your bracers, but now you come in with a Take Aim, and then reload the Sleep Dart already, and then come in, boom, 10. And they're unhappy because they've already committed 2 cards to blocking, and now they're leaking damage here. Just overall, the flexibility between Rain Razors, Bolt and Shot, Bullseye Bracers is just really strong right now. And the thing is, Bolt and Shot doesn't even need Rain Razors to be a big threat. You can go a similar play line, but let's just say you played like a Read the Glide Path at the start. Or not at the start. We'll just do it like this, where we pitch the 2, load the Bolt and Shot, draw our card. Could be anything. We'll just call it the Sleep Dart. We get to play Read the Glide Path, right? We get to look at the top card of our deck and look for an arrow. If it is an arrow, we'd leave it there. Assuming this isn't an arrow. I guess we'll call this we'll call it a Sink Below. So then we get to come in for 7, go again, on hit, reload. Now, they're thinking, I need to block this out. So either they're throwing 2 cards in front of it, one being a defense reaction, or even 3 cards to stop that. But if they don't, it hits, maybe they block 6, take 1. You get to reload. We know there's an arrow on top from the glide, and we get to Azalea and come in with Dominate for 5. So Bolt and Shot has just felt amazing. Like, I wasn't sold on it. A lot of people had started playing it before we had Rain Razors, and I wasn't sold. And since playing it, it's probably one of the strongest arrows in the deck. Let me rephrase that. It's behind Red in the Ledger, but as far as like pure damage output and just being able to deal damage and close out games, I think Bolt and Shot it's overperformed. It's been wonderful. All right, what do I have next? Oh, and I guess that just digs into, if you don't have another arrow or you aren't able to buff the Bolt and Shot, you're often wanting to get it to the bottom. If possible, in slower matchups, you can look to stack a Rain Razors with a Bolt and Shot off your pitch stacking. And if you do that, you just have to be careful not to knock the Death Whistle to mess it up. Or if they're not together, you can knock all you want. But being able to pitch stack this together opens up some explosive plays that is hopefully going to be able to push some damage and close out some games against Guardians. So, yeah, so that's, I think I finished talking about the buffs. Yeah, I talked about the buffs and I talked about the arrows. And now we've got a few cards that don't fall in either of those categories. Actually, quite a few cards. So I will go ahead and jump into that. Let's just set that off to the side. Battering bolts. Bolt shots. So first off, we've got 3 Sigil of Solace. This is another card that there's a lot of discussion on in Azalea, and I love this card. It never feels dead. It's always 3 health. In that aspect, against or not against on hits, this becomes always an efficient 3 block. You're never overblocking or whatever. It trades for 3 health, and it's so powerful in that aspect. The other thing to note is that unlike a lot of decks, we get to see 5 cards a turn. So, while it's not quite having 5 intellect, it's almost like having 5 intellect. And on that token, that means that Sigil of Solace becomes 1/5 of our hand, as opposed to in other decks, it's 1/4 of their hand. Which means that we are getting more value out of a Sigil, because all of our other cards are less valuable, just based on their stats, than other decks have. So Sigil is just, it trades 1 card for 1 card on average with other decks, but when we have more cards than them, that's just beautiful. And kind of the same logic applies here when we've got Sink Belows, Fate for Scenes, and Take Covers. Being able to have these super efficient cards, trading cards with our opponent, lets us get even more value out of Death Dealer by proxy. Yeah, so I think that, yeah, I mean, that's just about all I have to say. These defense reactions are wonderful. They actually, there's so many talking points I want to talk about. I'll set that to the side for now. Either way, Sigil, in addition to that, is also a card that fits really well into hands, right? So what I mean by that is, let's just say you've got a hand like, we'll call that on top. Something awkward like this left in your hand. You know, you get to pitch a Sleep Dart, load probably a Remorseless, and draw a card. I know that this got pitched, sorry. We don't know about that. So this is still in my hand. I know that I don't have a way of playing this Sleep Dart this turn realistically. So the single card in my deck that I want to draw right now is Sigil of Solace, because any other card, I mean, I guess aside from buffs, let me rephrase that. Aside from buffs also fit this playline, but this kind of fits into that category with the buffs, where this is a card that I can immediately play and then get to arsenal my remaining card, right? So in hands where we have, I don't know, it just fits there really well. The other thing to note is, sorry, I'm getting a little distracted. The other thing to note here is Sigil of Solace also fits another role in the fact that it fits into all of these hands, but also whenever we end a turn, we want to have an arsenal, because getting the cross-wrapped opt at the start of the turn is going to be a non-zero value. I don't know what the math would actually work out to, how much you value an opt at. I would say it's probably like somewhere in the range of 1/3 of a card, half a card, somewhere in there, in like generated value in just knowing, being able to plan. It's really hard to come up with the exact number, but the fact that we can take Sigil of Solace in any hand and go, I'm going to set this aside as my final card that isn't getting played, I can play out the rest of my hand and I can still put this in arsenal at the end of my turn. And now this card that could have fit into the previous hand is now sitting there ready to be used for cross-wrap, giving me my opt, and then I have the flexibility of, maybe I see a red in the ledger on top and I've got a couple buffs, and I go, okay, I'm going to leave this here and I'm just going to Azalea. Or I could play it out and then Death Dealer and get my draw and get the whole thing going. So this is a card that we can always put into the arsenal at the end of the turn and generate the cross-wrap value, and then it also has flexibility on the turn after. It can either be the card in arsenal that we need to get away for Azalea, or it can be the just played out at the start to free up the arsenal to continue that playline. So in a deck that often will feel clunky in the fact that there are inherent consistency issues in a deck that doesn't have a weapon, this is a card that minimizes clunk because it fits into every single hand and is never dead. Another important note is the fact that this is a card we can put into our arsenal that doesn't get blown up by Command and Conquer. It's one thing that this deck is really going to struggle with, especially in the way that I play it, is I always am trying to save one card to put in the arsenal just to get that opt at the start. That opt at the start also is going to be important if you are intentionally pitch stacking stuff like a Bolton Shot with a Rain Razors. By being able to opt and just send that card to the bottom, I mean, you don't have to. If the card works, the card works. But you can send that card to the bottom, and it gets you just closer to your pitch stack. So you can set up your endgame and dig to it fast. Almost, probably faster than an Oldhim. I think we're probably the single deck that can dig through our deck to get back to our pitch stack the fastest. Obviously, with the exception of if you knock, you mess up your pitch stack. But if you know that you've stacked something like this together, you can just aggressively opt every turn. You can aggressively sink below. You can aggressively fate foreseen. Just dig through that deck. I mean, and read the glide path. We've got so many cards in here that just let us cycle through the deck and get back to our stack. So Sigil is a card, again, I was getting with, is it lets us opt, but it goes into the arsenal, setting up that opt, but it's not a card that gets stuck there with Command and Conquer. This is a card that they come in with a Command and Conquer to mess up our turn. If this is a defense reaction, we're going to have a bad time because we block and now our arsenal's clogged and it just feels bad. Sigil you can just play out and block however you feel because you're not under the pressure of losing your arsenal card at that point. Obviously you don't get the opt after that, but that's perfectly fine. You made their Command and Conquer a vanilla 2 for 6, which isn't anywhere near as much as a 2 for 6 that's threatening and on hit. So Sigil, it just adds to consistency and fits in every single hand. Yeah, card's insane. That's kind of my final takeaway for that. So I talked about pitch stacking. Or it's not necessarily pitch stacking. Really, only this is the only two that you need to. Or I guess these are the only two that you need to worry about pitch stacking together: the Rain Razors and the Bolt and Shot. But when you get those two together, you can dig through your deck and set up a turn. I mean, obviously, you'd like to have something with it, whether that's like a Seek and Destroy or Remorseless or something. Red in the Ledger isn't great with it, because then you end up coming in for like a 15 damage turn, and then they're just going to block. Because why wouldn't you block? But yeah, stacking that stuff together can be really, really powerful, and being able to dig through it is good. So that covers the kind of defensive package, the sigils and the 9 defense reactions. And the last few cards I've gotten here are going to be Ravenous Rabble, Enlightened Strike, and Command and Conquer. They're all interesting. Man, I'm going to keep talking about the Bolt and Shot stuff, or even just Bolt and Shot in general, because you've got another fun line that when you fire like a Bolt and Shot with a +3 buff, right? So like a Seek and Destroy, and they go 7, threatening a reload. I've got 1 resource floating, and in this situation, you'd have your Tunic available. They go, oh shoot, I need to block 7. So they might throw like a piece of equipment and some 3 blocks. Or maybe they'll throw 3 cards thinking that it's going to stop. Maybe your bracers are gone. Being able to go Bolt and Shot, get a bunch of blocks, and then afterwards use the Tunic and come in with a Command and Conquer, because they thought you wanted to reload and fire another arrow, but you didn't. You wanted to Command and Conquer. It can often strand their arsenal and get them killed, or get the arsenal killed. So that's another really... Sorry, I'm really high on Bolt and Shot and Seek and Destroy. Sorry, Bolt and Shot and Rain Razors. Just Bolt and Shot in general has felt so good. Sorry. Back to these. Let's get this out of here. Enlightened Strike just fits really well. Sometimes you've got large hands where you need to use Go Again. Sometimes you have 3-card hands where you want to go to 7. If you have a 2-card hand, oftentimes it's draw a card. But overall, it's just a flexible card. I mean, it's Enlightened Strike. It's really just hard to argue with. The card's good. You play it in here. It often gets used as a 3-block, but it fits into hands. It's the reason why Enlightened Strike is good in other decks is under the same reason as to why Sigil is so good in this deck. It's flexibility, and it fits into every hand in some way. There's no individual use that's like busted on this card, but the fact that it's so flexible and you can fit it into any hand is what gives it its power, and it's the consistency. So this just adds to the consistency of the deck, something that it already lacks. So this kind of fits in a similar category to the Sigil. The next discussion is Rabble. We run, typically after sideboarding, I'm going to be on about, I want to say, 38 to 40 reds. Somewhere in that range. Or I guess, no, it would be, because it's 6 blues, 15 yellows. So that would be, 39 reds. So about 2/3 of the time, this is coming in for 4. And if this was just a 0 for 4 with Go Again, that would be good in a lot of decks, but it's just not quite what we're looking for here. The main goal of this is, well, actually, it leaks damage a lot of times, but just being able to see the top of the deck lets us set up plays. The card used to be a lot more important than it is now, and that's purely because of Read the Glide Path existing. This is our 3 and look at the top, except this lets us put that card to the bottom if we need. So it lets us, we get to make a choice, whereas Ravenous Rebel just gives us information. Granted, it ends up being about 3.6, 3.7 damage, as Read the Glide Path is only 3. But the fact that this often goes with an on-hit, realistically, they end up being pretty comparable cards. However, the choice of putting stuff to the bottom makes Read the Glide Path better, and the fact that it is often also tacked onto a dominated hit means that this damage is actually getting through. So against decks that are trying to fatigue you, Ravenous Rabble just doesn't quite do as much as something like Read the Glide Path. Whereas against like an aggro deck, they're never going to block this. And this lets us get their health down, because we can have dominated red in the ledgers all we want, but we actually have to kill our opponents. And against an aggro deck, we can slow them down all we want, but if they're not dying, they're just setting up. And a good player is going to set up a big turn against us. So this is just kind of some chip damage there that we need. And Command and Conquer is just Command and Conquer. It's mainly there for the Prism matchup, but it's also a ton of value. And it's just a ton of value, and it's good into most everything. Another thing to note, I think I've basically covered all the cards in the deck, because that's just the intro to the deck. But now I'll get into kind of some sideboarding stuff, some game plan strategies, and how we look at different decks in the meta. And I think that's a really interesting thing about the... Sorry, I sound conceited when I say it's an interesting thing about the way I've built the deck, is the deck, as far as sideboard options, you'll notice I don't have many arrow sideboard options, which traditionally was something really nice about Azalea, is you could put in the arrows that were useful for the particular matchup. Here, in pretty much every matchup, I'm only taking out 3 arrows, whether that's, 3 battering shots, 3 sleep darts, 3 fatigue shots. Those are typically the choices. But at most, I'm taking out 3 arrows in any given matchup. And the reason I don't have a lot of arrows in the sideboard is because I found that when you're playing against fatigue matchups, an arrow isn't going to do quite as much damage as a buff is going to do. Right? So the idea against a fatigue deck is they want to reduce all the damage in your deck, or negate it, until you've got no damage left. And the issue we run into is we run out of damage faster because we don't have a weapon that's doing damage. Traditionally, a weapon is used, you pitch, and they block with a card. So now they're down a card, but we've pitched, and that's going back into our deck. So we're able to get a card advantage on them as far as total value in the deck. The problem with Azalea is we don't have that. It's just not a thing. So the only way to win would either be to, I guess there's 2 ways. One would be to just pure out-tempo them and force through turns where they can't block enough of the damage, and you just go super wide and super tall and all that, and they just can't block it all. Which isn't really an option. The deck doesn't do enough damage in a single turn for that. So the other option is going to be dominating arrows and forcing damage through. not letting them block effectively. And so we need to find a lot of that before we get to the end of the deck. The problem is we can't do that every turn, right? And so a lot of turns where we can't force through damage, we just want to get cards out of their hands so they can't crack back and force us to block. So that's where stuff like E-Strike for 7 or Command and Conquer for 6 come in, because it forces blocks and lets them not swing back, so we get to come back with a full hand. So like your standard kind of play pattern there would be like, you know, you E-Strike for 7, get an Arsenal, I don't know, Arsenal like a Rabble or something. And then your Guardian opponent is going to block with 2 cards, Liga damage, right? But then now it's a Bravo with 2 cards in hand. He's just coming in with a hammer for 6. So maybe we throw like a defense reaction in front of it, right? And now we get to come back with a reasonable hand. We've got the Rabble, which if we Rabble from the Arsenal, obviously we've opted first. We Rabble from the Arsenal. We've got 3 cards in hand. Most Guardians aren't going to block that. Or maybe they do. Maybe they throw 3 in front of it. We leak 1. Then we get to go set up a Dominate because we've got the 3-card hand, which turns into 4 because we draw off Death Dealer. So just being able to use these as 2-card bring back tempo, or to some extent, is just super valuable in those matchups. In the meantime, we're setting up these Dominate turns. I feel like I rambled there and got a little bit distracted, but I'll dive into matchups. I know I've been talking a lot about the control matchups, and keep in mind a lot of this is speculative. I haven't gotten quite as much testing. This is taking my understanding of the game as a whole, as well as my understanding of how the matchups were previously, and kind of just extrapolating that in order to come to these conclusions as to how we need to play different matchups. So the first major group of matchups is going to be straight control. So that's going to be like your Bravo and your Oldhim. There's going to be some decks that are can be closer to that could fatigue you if they really tried, but it's going to be harder for them, and that'll be kind of a separate category. But for now, we're going to talk about the Oldhim and the Bravo, and maybe star of the show. I don't know how he's actually going to play. It's a bit tough to tell. So in those matchups, we need like all the buffs, because like I was saying, you come in for 5 Dominate with an arrow that's pushing 2 damage, probably less. So 1 arrow is essentially 2 damage. We'll just say in theory, because they can block. Whereas these buffs can turn into 3, or even if they've got equipment, it could be less. But these buffs, when put on a dominated arrow, just translate to raw damage. So we need to have enough damage in the deck to actually kill them. So that's why we're going to be running all of these buffs. And that also ties into what I was discussing earlier. I mean, I was in the process of trying to say it and I got distracted. But that's why there aren't quite as many arrows, is because when we go into these slow matchups, we need as many buffs as we can and not quite that many arrows, because we need to be the aggressor and we need to kill them. And arrows, while they are important, if I was to say have 6 hamstrings in the sideboard and take out 6 of these buffs, when I go into that Guardian matchup, I'm going to have a lot more arrows and not as many buffs as I would like, and that's going to turn into a slower game plan that just isn't going to be enough to kill the Guardian. So finding or getting all these buffs in the deck is really important. Where am I? I'll find them. I don't know where my take aim went. It's going to bother me. Oh yeah, this is my stupid non-foil one. I have a 3rd foil one, but it's heavily warped, so it's in a book right now. Yeah, so all of these buffs plus the Rain Razors. I don't think I'm putting Smashing Good Time in. It is technically a +3 for 0. I don't think it goes in against Bravo. You might put it in against Oldhim just so you can play the full stack of cards. But I haven't given it enough testing, and that seems like a bad idea in theory. There it is. But we go up to, or I guess I go up to 18 buffs, which hopefully is enough. I'm actually just curious. 3, So this is 936, right? Yeah, 36, 44, 50. So the total buff damage on these is 50, which means if we can, I mean, it's obviously a tall task to try and assume that every single buff here is going to get played on a dominated arrow, and so it's going to be raw damage. This is enough damage in the deck to kill your opponent when you account for armor. Theoretically. Realistically, it wouldn't be on its own. You're going to need the dominated damage from the arrows, you're going to need them to leak some damage, and you're going to need to find chips, whether that's Rabble for 4, E-Strike for 7, that little 1 and 2 here. But in theory, this should be enough damage in the deck to kill them. That's the first kind of hurdle, is making sure you have enough damage in the deck to kill them. The second thing you need to make sure you have is make sure you have enough health to kill them before they kill you. Because when we start blocking, we may not be able to find those dominates quite the same way. And that's another thing where like these sigils become super efficient, whether that's, I've got some sigils in the deck, and whenever my opponent swings an Anathos for 6, I get to block with a defense reaction, take 2, because I don't want a defense reaction plus a 3 block, because that's overblocking. So I can take 2 here, sigil, and I end up +1. So I gained a health, and then, that little bit can hopefully find you enough of a gap to be able to take the damage when you know you can push back big dominated damage. And realistically, one of the really, really big things we got in this set for like the Bravo matchup is, where are my arrows? The new arrow fatigue shot. This arrow is insane against Bravo, because this arrow says, it's never actually going to make their Crippling Crush come in for 6, but the thing is that on paper it does, is the important part. Because if I come in with a fatigue shot for 5, that Bravo is sitting there with blue, 3 blues and a Crippling Crush, and they go, crap, I wanted to dominate Crippling Crush. I can't anymore. I mean, something like Remorseless doesn't stop that. I guess Sleep Dart technically does. So does whatever. But Red in the Ledger stops the dominate. But the thing is, that deck they don't even need to dominate. You hit them with a Sleep Dart, you hit them with a Red in the Ledger, they don't need to dominate. Just them being able to fire a Crippling Crush for 11 is going to eat your hand, right? It doesn't even need to be dominated. It's going to eat your hand, and all of a sudden we're using up these arrows that we have, and now we don't have enough arrows to put these buffs on. When we have to block with too many arrows, we're going to just run out of damage. So another way that they're able to fatigue you is making you block. And by using Fatigue Shot, it gets confusing because I keep talking about fatigue. But by using Fatigue Shot, it means that all they get to really do is swing Hammer. So you're not actually lowering the damage on their attack, but you are disrupting their turn. Or even they would come back with a Spinal Crush for 9. That demands 2 cards. But as soon as you hit them with a Fatigue Shot, that Spinal Crush is coming in for 5. You block with 1 card and it stops the crush. And as a result, they don't get to play that Spinal Crush. And maybe they end up blocking with it, which means that that's a card that I don't have to worry about later on in the game. So that's where this Fatigue Shot comes in. It's just super useful. Also, with the new card like Pulverize, being able to fire a Fatigue Shot at them when they have Pulverize, they would need at least 2 blues to block this, right? So this is probably, if they have a Pulverize in Arsenal, let's just say they made a Seismic Surge, put a Pulverize in Arsenal, they have 4 Surges now. Heaved, rather. You come in with a Fatigue Shot, and they either have to 2-card block it, right? And then they can come in with the Pulverize. They don't get to dominate, but that's fine. They could block with Equipment, and when we're getting Equipment on a Fatigue Shot, that's pretty good. Or this is buffed, right? This comes in for 8, and they realize it's either Equipment and 2 cards, and they don't get to dominate, or maybe even best, we come in with this with dominate. They don't have a defense reaction in Arsenal because they've got a Pulverize there. All of a sudden, that heave, they just set up 4 Seismic Surge tokens, and they're going to waste. Or they fire a Pulverize for 7. Card's just really good against what Guardian's trying to do right now. I haven't played enough of it to make it to be able to say that I think it's a good matchup right now, but it's significantly better than what it used to be. Oldham, on the other hand, I think it's still going to be a bad time. We don't have many blues. We have a hard time with Frostbite, but it might be doable. I haven't actually gotten any games in against Oldham since the new cards, but hopefully all the Oldhams are gone, and it will just be Bravo Star of the Show as well as regular Bravo. It's fine. I can just live in Magical Christmas Land where Oldham doesn't exist. But in reality, it might not actually be that bad. We've got a lot of these defense reactions to deal with the Winter's Wail, and I don't know. I'm just gonna say that it's a bad matchup, but might be winnable. Something I gotta work on a little more. Let's see. So that's the defensive stuff. So in those matchups, I'm boarding in everything except for Smashing Good Times, and then these are the cards that stay out, and then the other 72 just get put in. Because like I mentioned, we're getting to our second cycle and our third cycle super fast. Just having more quality cards is good. So like putting in stuff like Release the Tension. This is going to be better than most of my second cycle cards. And it slows us down from getting to fatigue, because I think versus a Bravo, we can beat them in tempo. In the fact that like we can be the aggressor and make them play on the back foot and play defensively. The problem is that defensive game plan will get them to you running out of cards. So you have to make sure you kill them in time. But just turn over turn, I think we can outvalue them and just out-tempo them. Because we've got enough of those tools right now. So the main goal is just making sure you can kill them before you run out of cards. That's kind of the hard step, or hard part of it. Okay, so that's the first kind of sideboard. The next sideboard is going to be almost the exact opposite. Not quite. But it's going to be very different. Here we're playing for efficiency in the using these defense reactions for the full 4 health. And making sure that we can use stuff like Memorial Grounds to set up Dominate to make sure that we push the damage through and they can't block us out. The secondary game plan here that I'm going to talk about is what I call the full gas game plan. We're going to take out all the defense reactions. Probably going to take out 3 arrows. Which 3 those are depends on the matchup. And then like 2 Smashing Good Times or maybe Memorial Ground, something in that category. But we want to go down to a lean 60 and just be able to go full gas. And this is the strategy we're going to play against Prism. I guess Prism's the main boogeyman thing. We can't keep up with her auras anymore. Let me rephrase that. We never could, but it's even less possible now. And I think the only way we can beat Prism right now is to hit her in the face and get her to a health threshold where she cannot just play out auras, take damage to play out auras. So he's just gotta kill her. And I think anything except for Arclight Sentinel. So let me rephrase that. Most turns you're gonna want to shoot their face, except for Arclight Sentinel, because you don't have a choice. Genesis early on. There's probably some exceptions where you get forced to block and you have a low hand, and I don't know, maybe you're able to fire like a Ridge Rider shot at their aura, sure. But anytime we've got buffs, we're just going face. And we want to get them to a stage where they have to be blocking with 3 cards from their hand. I mean, ideally it's 4, but 3 is kind of the bare minimum. And we want to just kill them. Prism will kill you if you take too long, because we can't keep up with their auras. So I think it's probably our worst matchup. But that's kind of the Hail Mary game plan is I'm going to draw the nuts, full gas, and they're not going to have Arclight Sentinel or Genesis super early on, and they'll just get overwhelmed and die. It's kind of worked for me in practice. It's felt the closest to being able to win, and I've gotten a few games as well, but it's definitely the worst matchup. The next one on that list that's going to be a similar sideboard is Dash, which it's interesting because I think Control Dash is the better list. Boost Dash might be okay, but into Control Dash, we can't take that slow game plan where we're planning on playing for tempo and card value, because realistically, if you let Dash get 3-4 items out, you are just going to lose the value game. Dash gets way too much value. So we need to focus on the early game where we have more efficient, better turns than Dash. And so in that matchup, obviously you're going to have the Smashing Good Times to deal with the things, but... Oh, sorry, let me dip back there. Guardians were playing Perch Grapplers. Prism were playing Perch Grapplers for Erudition. Dash were playing Snaps. The only on-hit that Dash is really going to have is the... What's the card? Command and Conquer. And I think I want the Snaps just because that opens up turns with Rain Razors where you don't have to use... Or it doesn't have to be Bolt and Shot. You know, you can go Fire and Arrow, Rain Razors, Snaps, take aim, fire another arrow. And that second arrow is coming in for 10. Or use the Bullseye Bracers if you don't have the take aim. Or something along those lines. But I think Snaps letting us get extra value out of the Rain Razors is going to be the play there. Additionally, Snaps protect us a little bit better against T-Bone in case it is like an aggro dash. But again, yeah, that's going to be the take covers out, and I think Memorial Grounds come out. But it's something in that vicinity. But again, that's a full gas strategy. We don't want that game to go late. We can't let that game go late. And the thing about Dash is because of their items, you can catch them a little bit better with awkward hands where they have to take damage because they either can't block with the item or they need to save the item plus a card to pitch to pay for it. So now they only have 6 that they can block with. That's the theory, at least. I've had reasonable success against Dash. It's always felt like a very doable matchup. You just have to know that you need to play aggressive into them because they have a better end game than us. Next on the list, we've got Viscerai, which is a weird one because you've got mid-range and you've also got OTK. I think we do fine against mid-range, and I think it's OTK that we would struggle with a little bit more. And as a result, I think I like taking the more aggressive strategy. Because the other thing is, if we go more aggressive, most of our arrows are quite good into a mid-range Viscerai. The Remorseless is dealing a bunch of damage. Red in the Ledger is shutting down their turns. Sleep Dart is shutting off all the rune chants. Even Fatigue Shot can be fine. Against a mid-range, we have the tools in our deck to kill them, or to disrupt them, that we don't really need these defense reactions. And then versus OTK, we need to kill them fast. So these are coming out against Viscerai. And then, I guess, Smashing Good Times and figure out something else. Sideboarding is still a little bit weird because I'm still working through the deck. But and the same game plan against Kano for a similar reason. Not quite because we're racing, but more so because these defense reactions do nothing. And that's the second category of deck for me. The next strategy is going to be aggressive decks. So that would be stuff like your Briar, I guess Bolton to an extent, Lexi. These decks that don't inherently block really well, and I guess even the mirror match you would probably board like this, is where we're going to play more of a slim 60, because we're not getting fatigued. Like, a Briar isn't going to fatigue you. So we can play a slim 60, and then the goal is just kind of to play efficiently, because I think we can match their value, if not outvalue them turn over turn. We just want to make sure that we put them in positions where they need to block, and also not leak too much damage, so when they have a big turn, we don't just die. Or if we have a hand without blocks, we need to maintain a health margin, and just play for overall efficiency. That's something that Azalea does really well, is the turn over turn. She's very efficient. Assuming you don't brick, but, you know, it is what it is. Yeah, and I think that's basically the plan into aggro. I think previously aggro matchups had been a little bit better. We've put in a few more 2-block buffs, and 0 blocks. So occasionally the aggro can feel a little scary, but I think overall it's probably fine. It was probably just how I've been boarding or the quality of the players I've been playing against. But aggro has felt a little more scary than it used to. Not 100% sure if that's the reason, but that's the theory at least. The next category is kind of either pseudo able to fatigue you, or what we would say is like we're not 100% sure how they're going to play and we need to hedge board. And that's going to be your Rhinar, your Katsu, and your Dory. So Rhinar could be playing Claws, which if you know they're on Claws, you could play a Slim 60. But the problem is if a Rhinar plays Club and decides to fatigue you, and you play a Slim 60, you're probably going to get fatigued. He's just very efficient 2-card hands and loves throwing cards in front to block when he's playing a club list. So Dory is going to be a similar situation where everything 3 blocks, they've got a ton of armor. And if you're not careful, because like Dory, I'm speaking more about Dawnblade, and I think Hatchets is going to be a similar case, just slightly different reasoning. The Dawnblade forces blocks a lot, so we're going to end up using a lot of our damage to stop the Dawnblade, which then means that we could, at some point, not have enough damage dealt to be able to kill them in 60. And combine that with everything blocking 3, they've got the armor, they've got the shunts. Dory, I like to board up a little bit, so that's probably going to be in the range of like 66, 68 cards, 69, just for the fun of it. You probably don't board in everything, but it's somewhere in the middle there. So it's the same for Rhinar. And then the last one is Katsu. Katsu is a weird one, because obviously you want a Slim 60 against aggro Katsu, but if you get a straight control Katsu, fatigue Katsu, you're going to lose on 60. Back in the Monarch meta when I was playing this deck, I lost way too many games to Katsu control because I thought they would be aggro. One was at the Vegas Calling, where I was like, no one's playing control Katsu. It's not good right now. Everyone's playing aggro Katsu. So I'm going to board for aggro. And it was control. And, you know, I'm convinced that it's near impossible to beat aggro or control Katsu if you're boarded for aggro, because you're often boarding out some buffs as well as just lower count. You get fatigued faster. It's the worst feeling in the world. Okay, that's probably an exaggeration, but the expression stands. It feels really bad when you sit down against a Katsu, and turn 2 you fire, I don't know, let's just say like Sleep Dart for 7, right? And they go block for 3 and then yellow Flick Flack, and you go, oh crap, they're playing yellow Flick Flack, which means all they're doing is trying to block here. So I'm just dead. The game's over. You can pivot to try and be super efficient with how you're swinging damage. You don't get to block like at all. But I've never been able to pull that win off. When I board up to 70 against the control Katsu, I do just fine. I never run out of cards before killing them. But when I'm at 60, they're still sitting on like 7-8 HP, and I just can't find enough damage in the deck. So my rule of thumb with Katsu is always to hedge board, assume their control, because you can still beat aggro if you're boarded for control. It's going to be a little bit tougher because you're going to have more 2 blocks in the deck, and just overall, you don't have your best 60. You've got some lower quality cards in the matchup. But I think making the aggro a slightly lower percentage, but having the control matchup, I think the control matchup's actually good if you have 70. It's just the way to go. So Katsu I hedge board against, unless you know 100% that they're aggro. And the last two decks are Chain and Levi. And this is one that I don't think that this deck is built properly for Chain and Levi. And the idea against Chain and Levi is to play very, very slow and very defensive, which again, I don't think that this deck is quite built that way. Chain is in the form of fatiguing, which we used to be able to do it. I don't know if we still can, because Chain is a lot more aggressive and more explosive, but we used to be able to do it. So I need to get some practice in to see, but the idea would be to just fatigue him. And whenever you're able to hold 2 cards, you get to fire like a Red in the Ledger for 5, but or a Remorseless, or a Sleep Dart. All of those are super disruptive to chain, and you just kind of get that chip in where you can. Levi is going to be another thing where everybody makes the meme, oh, Levi, you just hit her with a Sleep Dart and she dies. Well, that doesn't happen until they're 15 blood debt, or even at like 6 blood debt. Like, it's not going to end the game. It's good at that point, but it doesn't end the game. They need to be higher. So against and the other thing is, you hit them with that Sleep Dart, that doesn't win there. That says I win at the end of their turn. They still have the full grip to come back and try and kill you. I actually dropped a game like that to a Levi at a Road to Nationals last year, where he had 15 blood debt. I hit him with a Sleep Dart, dominated for like 5 when he didn't have the equipment block, and I was like, boom, got the Sleep Dart through. Now he's gonna die to his blood debt at the end of his turn, and then he threatened like 25 damage, and I died. Because, you know, just it doesn't insta-kill them, it kills them at the end of their turn. So you want to make sure to hold that health margin. So you're going to play pretty defensively against Levi in order to let them build up their blood debt and maintain that health. And then when you see an opportunity, that's when you go for the Sleep Dart. You go for the kill. And then at that point, ideally you'll have enough health to where they can't just kill you, even with a really good hand. So that's the theory. It's not a matchup I get to play a lot. It's probably not a matchup that you need to worry too much about, but that's just kind of the theory behind that matchup. Yeah, so that's roughly where I am with the deck. I guess I'll discuss there are some cards that feel really, really good in the deck, and some cards that are very, like, maybe in the deck. And so some of these are going to have some room to adjust. So let me pull out what I would consider to be the core of the deck. Get this cleaned up. Obviously, Death Dealer is always played. I think Bracers are always played. Tunic's always played. Cross Wrap is always played. These are your core equipment. Your weapon or your boots are going to swap between these two. As for these, like, you have a core as far as arrows, in the sense that you have a minimum amount of arrows you want to play, but that doesn't actually, no actual arrow in that. I don't know how to phrase that. I'll get into it in a second. Buffs. I think this is core, and core. These go off in the side. Sorry, Rain Razors are core. Sigils, E-Strikes. Ridge Riders, Nox, Remorseless. Where are the rest of my cards? Why are they not in order anymore? This is why we can't have nice things. Sleep Darts, Remorseless, Run the Ledger, Bolt and Shot. And honestly, you could even put Remorseless in the, no, I think it's just core. So I would say that this is kind of the core of the deck. So I guess I'll separate it properly. You got to list Red in the Ledger first for your arrows. You got Red in the Ledger, Remorseless, Bolt and Shot, and Ridge Rider Shot, I think are the core 12 arrows. In most matchups where you're playing 60 cards, you're going to be putting in all but 3 of the other arrows. So Fatigues, we're running 6. Sleep Darts, we're running 6. Battering Bolts, we're running a 3. So, yeah. We've got the 12 core, and then I end up putting in 12 of these to bring us to 24 arrows, which is about 40% arrows. And that's kind of the number that's worked best for me. I don't have a mathematical reason, but it's just what it's been. So typically I'm going to pick 3 of these to not play, and then everything else goes in, unless I'm boarding up to a higher number. If I'm boarding up above like 65, then I might throw all of them in. But for the most part, one of one group of 3 of these is not getting played. So that is the core arrows. Knock the Death Whistle is unfortunately core. I don't actually have a great reason for it. It's probably just fine. Sigil of Solace, like I said, I think this card fits in every hand, is efficient, and just adds to consistency. It's not an overperformer, but it never underperforms. At least in my eyes. And that's the same thing with E-Strikes. These are just... they fit. They're never bad. And because of their flexibility, it just adds to the consistency of the deck. So I think these 6 are always in. Rain Razors, I think, is probably one of the best buffs we have and one of the best tools. It's why Bolt and Shot is now core, because Rain Razors exists. Then for other buffs, we've got Read the Glide Path. This card, it's another thing that it's adding to consistency. I know it's the age-old thing that people talk about Azalea is she has this power. The problem is she's just not consistent. So these, I guess everything but the Rain Razors here, are cards that add to consistency of Azalea. And that is probably the most important thing. And then I've got Take Aim's Seek and Destroys. Take Aim is just a flexible tool. Seek and Destroy is just a powerful buff. And we need to make sure we have buffs in the deck. Rain Razors, I guess, I know I'm just talking about consistency. Rain Razors is not a consistent card. It is usually good, has a very high ceiling, but it also has a really low floor. It's kind of a wild card, but the average is very high, and it makes it worth using. But it's definitely not a consistent card. I guess that's the best I can say about that. So what do we got? 9, 18, 21, plus another 15 is 36. So this is only a 36 card core in theory. The problem is, yeah, so that's 36 core here. The thing is, with these arrows, you're essentially going to have 12 more, brings you up to 48 core. And then when we're playing for gas, it's typically going to be like this package. If we're playing defensive, it's the defense reaction package. And then these are kind of flex spots. Like I said, I've been liking Memorial Ground less and less. It's, I don't know. It's another 0 block, and I'd rather Rain Razors most of the time. It's obviously good. I mean, I guess the value behind Memorial Ground is the same as it was before. It's less important now because we have better access to Dominate, but it's the same reason I was talking about with red or Yellow Glide, is the fact that this is a card that gets pitched early. You don't play this very often early, but you get around to that second cycle and third cycle. This becomes obviously you have to use a full card, but it becomes set up a Dominate of your best target arrow. I mean, I guess aside from Battering Bolt, which there have been times where I wanted to get Battering Bolt back, but I couldn't. This is just a really, really strong second cycle card. I mean, until you need to block and you die because you have it in hand. That happens more than I'd like to admit, but card's just really strong second cycle. It might be on the chopping block. Yeah, speaking of chopping block, let's talk about that. Cards that have felt like they underperformed slightly and I could see cutting. I think really it's just these Rebels. Smashings could come out if you don't have many dashes in the meta, but I think there's space for them to keep them in. And then Memorial Ground. These are cards that I could see lowering, and I've actually been bouncing between which of these cards I played 2 of. I think today I played only 2 Rebels, and I played 3 Smashing. I cut Memorial to 2 at one point and played 3 Smashing, but right now I'm at 2 Smashing. I could see these becoming different cards, but I think everything else in the deck has felt really good. There's really just not... Yeah, everything's just felt good. Which is weird, because I'm playing Azalea, and I'm not used to cards feeling cohesive. Because the deck has obviously suffered from some consistency issues. But it's just overall felt really good so far. I probably should have included this disclaimer at the start and not now, is I think Azalea is at the best she's been in a long time, but I would still not recommend playing Azalea for your pro quests and all that in your major events. The deck went from being arguably the worst deck in the game to maybe average, maybe a little below average, which is a huge improvement. But if you're like, man, I need to find a spicy deck that's going to win me my pro quest, this isn't it. Yeah, there's nothing more to say. This isn't it. Deck's fun. I think it's really interesting, just kind of fundamentally different to a lot of other decks. I mean, obviously you don't have a weapon, you're playing stuff out of arsenal, and you have more control over zones. With the Azalea ability, you're now playing... The top card of your deck is essentially like another card, is an extension of your hand. I don't remember who it was. Some YouTuber, I apologize, I don't remember which one you were, called the top card of the deck an extension of the hand. And that's really kind of the core fundamental of Azalea. And, you know, cards like Ravenous Rabble, cards like your Glide, cards like your Cross Wrap, all of that lets you see the last card in your hand. And that's a really powerful thing. And it just plays different than other decks. And it's a deck that I would highly recommend trying out. But don't bring it to a competitive event if you expect to win. If you expect to have fun, go for it. I'm probably going to end up bringing it to some pro quests just because it's my favorite deck. But yeah, it's just very fundamentally different to a lot of decks. And that's why you're going to see a lot of diehard Azalea fans. It's because it doesn't play like any other deck. And so we dedicate way too much time to trying to make it work. Yeah, it's a long ramble, but that's where I stand on the deck. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, I guess I'll wrap up there. Yeah, so this is Levi Roundtable at Wraith, talking about my favorite deck and where it stands in the current meta and where I think its power level is and how to play and a variety of other topics that I've covered. So thanks for watching. If for some odd reason you're still watching and didn't get bored of me rambling, appreciate you listening, and that will be it for me.